sit down, story time. Here we go. So let me tell you a story about how this sermon series really came to be, but also one story that sort of illustrates the big idea. So some years ago, we needed some woodwork done at our house. So we hired a contractor who was a woodworking specialist. And as he was doing the work, we started visiting. And he said, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, "Well, I'm a preacher." And he didn't, leave. And so I thought, we're off to a good start. So I'm a preacher. And he said, "Well, how did you become a preacher?" He didn't know who I was. So I told him. I said, "Well, how did you become a woodworker?" And he said, "It's a long story." I was like, "I got nothing else to do. Tell me the story." So he told the story. He said that he was a Christian. And when he was in his 20s, he went to church and he met a very sweet, godly, kind young woman, just fell in love with her and started to get to know her and pursue her and got to know her parents. And he said, when we started seeing one another, he said her parents started becoming a problem. He said they were very controlling, very overbearing. They had a lot of attitudes and opinions, and they were very, very religious. They would always quote verses and say, "God told me." And he said, I thought that maybe once we got married, things would get a little better. So they went through premarital and they got married. And he said, as soon as they got married, then all of these demands started coming from her parents. "You need to move to be closer to us. You're in the wrong church. You should come to our church. Our church does things the right way. You've got a job and it pays the bills, but you should come to work for your father-in-law and you should work for him." He said they wanted us to literally work for them, live near them, go under their church leadership, and control us entirely. He said when I was around them, they were so controlling that it created a lot of anxiety for my wife and I. He said then we kept telling them, "No, we're not going to sell our house. We're not going to change our job. We're not going to change our church. We love you. We're going to do things our way." He said then we had the blessing of becoming pregnant with a daughter. And he said everything then went to level 10. He said, as soon as they heard we were pregnant, "Well, you need to move, you need to be close to us, they need to go to this school, they need to go to this church, you need to baptize them as a baby in our church." He's like, "We don't believe in baby baptism. That's not our church. We're not leaving our house." He said, then the child was born and it was very constant pressure, especially through the mother-in-law, making a series of demands. Well, this creates a lot of anxiety for his wife because now she's dealing with pressure from her parents and disagreement from her husband. The child is born and they start berating the husband and father in front of the little girl. And he finally pulls them aside with his wife and says, "You can't berate me and attack and criticize us in front of our little girl." And what escalated it was they were at grandparents' house and the grandparents started attacking dad and the little girl started crying. They said, we don't want to go to grandma and grandpa's house and have our daughter in tears. Don't put the child in the middle. If we have an issue, let's talk privately, not in front of the child. He thought that fixed it. The daughter was a few years later, a bit older, and now she could speak and she could understand a little more of what was happening, not just absorbing the anxiety, but understanding the conversations. She came home, she said, "Dad, how come grandma and grandpa hate you?" He says, "What do you mean?" He said, she said, when you're not there, they talk about all the things that you do wrong. You go to the wrong church, you have the wrong job, and you don't lead your family the right way. So he grabbed his wife, went over to their house, said, "Okay, no more. We're creating a hard boundary unless you can promise that you're not going to put the granddaughter in the middle of the hostage negotiation. You can only see her with supervised visits, and if that isn't respected, you may not see her for a while. We're not going to tolerate this." He came home from work a few days later. His wife and daughter were gone. And there was a note from his wife saying, "We've moved back in with my parents." He called, she didn't answer. He drove to her parents' home, knocked on the door. Not surprisingly, mom and dad answered the door. And he was going to literally have to get through them to talk to his own wife. And he said, "What's going on?" And they said, quote, "When you got married, you joined our family. And if you're not going to join our family, we're taking our daughter back." And his wife was behind the mother and father, and she's crying, and there's the little girl also crying. He says, "Honey, please come here." So she comes out on the porch, and he looks at her, he's like, "Sweetheart, you need to come home with me. We need to talk about this. We need to figure out what we're going to do." And she said, quote, "I can't abandon my family." And he said, We are a family. Now, literally, this woman has her parents behind her, and then she is standing there with her daughter, and there is her husband. She's literally in the middle of a hostage negotiation with a little girl. And he said, well, honey, I'm gonna go home. I want you to come with me. Then the mother-in-law stepped in and said, and I quote, from now on, all communication will go through her attorney, and handed him a card for the lawyer that they had hired. He ended up getting divorced. Didn't want a divorce, didn't file for divorce, contested the divorce. Healed up, stayed in his church. Some years later, met another really sweet, godly young woman, started seeing her, met with the pastor, they went through premarital counseling, they got married. She was a single mom, had a few kids that he adopted and became the dad to, and had shared custody with his first daughter. So he tells the story. And so I asked him, I said, so how did you start woodworking? I mean, that was the, this is quite a story, And he said, my father-in-law my second father-in-law was a woodworker. He's a master craftsman. He has a company that he does woodworking. And he said, one day, my father-in-law invited me over to his shop to teach me woodworking, and I went, and he said, lo and behold, I love it. And he said, I love my father-in-law. He's probably my best friend. My father-in-law taught me woodworking, and we just hung out in the shop and did woodworking together. He said, so one day, my father-in-law complimented me and said, you're really good at woodworking. And he said, I was half joking and said, well, am I good enough to do it professionally? And his father-in-law said, yeah. And he said, I was joking, and I said, why don't you hire me? And his father-in-law said, okay. He said, that's how I got into woodworking. He said, now I work with my father-in-law, we're very close friends, and he's teaching me the business, and when he retires, I'm taking over his company. It dawned on him, he said, what's also really weird? We go to the same church. I said, how did that work? He said, well, they had a good church and we had a good church, but when there was a baby dedication or Christmas or whatever, because we have the grandkids, they would attend church with us to see their grandkids, and eventually we liked having them around, and when they would come to church with us, we'd go out to brunch. So we finally said, do you guys want to come to our church? And they said, sure. So now they attend church with us. They said, in some weekends, after church, we go out to brunch. Other weekends, we don't. Some weekends, they take the kids, and we have a full date day. Well, they take the kids to brunch and feed them dinner at their house. And he said, it's really weird. Sometimes we do vacations and holidays together as well. He said, now that I think about it, I'm doing everything that the first in-laws demanded. And I said, why? He said, because I like the new in-laws. They're loving, they're gracious, they're open-handed, they're not religious, controlling, or domineering, and they don't make us do things, so we enjoy doing those things with them. We're very, very close. The moral of the story is, are you a healthy person, and what's it like to have a relationship with you? And oftentimes when it comes to family and family systems talks that I'm gonna give, I oftentimes have people say, how do you make your kids have a relationship with you? How do you make your kids serve Jesus? How do you make your kids get along? I'll just tell you a secret about adults. You don't make them do anything. You try to be a healthy person and set up a healthy environment that they want to be in and that they want to make healthy decisions out of. Here was his quote: the greatest burden in my first marriage was my wife's parents. They broke our family. The greatest blessing in my second marriage is my wife's parents. Her family makes our family better. Hey, howdy, Pastor Mark here. Thanks for viewing the clip. And if you'd like the entire sermon, we've got it ready to go.